In a dry, barren land under the scorching sun, the small region of Gilead lay mostly ignored by the wider kingdom. To any onlooker, it was a rough, hard place to live, its people toughened by the demands of survival. But it was here, in this harsh and arid landscape, that a figure would arise, one destined to shape the history of Israel and to call a people lost in darkness back to light. His name was Elijah. Though little was known about Elijah's family or background, one thing was clear: he came at a time when Israel was in desperate need of truth and guidance. Israel was supposed to be a nation devoted to God, yet it had turned away, lured into idol worship under the influence of King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. Instead of leading his people toward God, Ahab had openly embraced Baal, a pagan deity, and encouraged the people of Israel to follow this false god. His queen Jezebel brought in hundreds of prophets of Baal, placing them in high positions and silencing anyone who dared oppose her. Jezebel's influence ran deep, and soon, idol worship became the norm. The people of Israel, once set apart by their devotion to God, now wavered between two beliefs, unable to fully commit to either. Some felt an unexplainable emptiness, but didn't know what had changed. Others worshipped Baal wholeheartedly, believing he held the power over their lives. The nation was confused, divided, and spiritually adrift. Against this backdrop, Elijah appeared, a prophet with a mission. His arrival would change the course of Israel's history, challenging both the king and the people to confront their choices. Elijah's presence alone was a warning, as if God had sent him to shake the people awake. He was like a fire in the darkness, his strength and faith radiating in a time when faith itself had become a rare thing. In a prophecy that many believed was meant for this very moment, the book of Malachi foretold, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." This prophecy echoed in the hearts of those who had not fully forgotten their roots, who still waited for the return of a prophet to call them back to God. Elijah's mission was to remind them who the true God was and to prepare them for what lay ahead. But Elijah's journey wouldn't be easy. He would face kings, suffer hardship, and stand against the most powerful forces in the land. Still, he would stand unwavering, guided by a purpose that came directly from God. Elijah's sudden appearance left people with more questions than answers. Where had he come from? Who were his family? Unlike other prophets whose lineages were often documented, Elijah arrived without mention of a father, a mother, or a lineage. He was simply called Elijah the Tishbite, suggesting he was from Tishbe, a place in Gilead. Some people wondered if he had been chosen by God from a young age, set apart for a purpose no one else could see. His lack of background only added to his mysterious presence, as if he were a figure from another world, a man bound to God and nothing else. The Bible offers little about Elijah's personal life or upbringing, and yet his impact on Israel was immense. Elijah seemed to embody the ruggedness of Gilead itself, a tough, relentless figure whose faith couldn't be shaken. This lack of a personal backstory made him almost symbolic, as though he represented something beyond himself, a messenger sent by God to deliver an urgent message to his people. Though Elijah's origins were shrouded in mystery, his arrival brought hope to those still clinging to their faith. People started to whisper about the prophecy in Malachi, which had foretold of a prophet who would come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Some wondered if Elijah was this prophet, a man sent to call Israel to repentance and to warn them of the consequences of their choices. It was clear that Elijah's role was unique. Unlike the kings and priests who had come before him, he was not bound by the politics of the land. He owed allegiance to no one but God. He was an outsider, not just to the courts of Ahab and Jezebel, but to the very society that had lost its way. This made him both powerful and dangerous, a man who could speak freely because he had nothing to lose. Elijah's journey began with a bold and dangerous step. He went directly to King Ahab, the man responsible for leading Israel away from God. The courage this took cannot be underestimated. Ahab was a powerful king, and to confront him was to risk one's life. But Elijah was undeterred. He was on a mission from God, and nothing would stop him. Standing before the king, Elijah delivered a message that would shake the kingdom to its core. He told Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." With this prophecy, Elijah declared that a severe drought would descend upon Israel. This drought would not be an ordinary one. It was a direct act from God, meant to show the people the consequences of their idolatry. Ahab and Jezebel worshipped Baal, a god of fertility and rain. By declaring a drought, Elijah was directly challenging the power of Baal. He was saying, in effect, your God has no power here. Only the true God can control the rain. It was a bold and dangerous statement, one that put Elijah's life at risk. As the drought set in, the land began to suffer. Rivers and streams dried up, crops withered, and animals grew thin and weak. The once fertile fields of Israel became barren, and people started to feel the weight of God's judgment. They had turned away from Him, and now they were experiencing the consequences. Months turned into years, and the drought showed no signs of ending. People grew desperate, but Ahab and Jezebel did not turn back to God. Instead, they clung even more tightly to Baal, believing he would save them. But as the drought continued, it became clear that Baal was powerless. The people of Israel were caught in a struggle, not just for survival, but for their faith. Many began to question their beliefs, wondering if they had been wrong to follow Baal. Elijah, however, knew the drought had a purpose beyond punishment. God was using this time to call His people back to Him, to show them that their idols were empty and powerless. The drought was a chance for the people to return to their roots, to remember the God who had brought them out of Egypt and given them the promised land. But would they heed the warning? As the drought worsened, God told Elijah to leave Israel and travel to a city called Zarephath, which lay outside the borders of Israel. This was an unusual command, as it meant Elijah would be leaving the land of his people. But God had a purpose. In Zarephath, there was a widow who would take care of him. This widow, though poor and without much to offer, was about to become part of a miracle that would reveal God's power and compassion. When Elijah arrived in Zarephath, he saw a woman gathering sticks. She looked tired and thin, as if life had worn her down. Elijah asked her for a drink of water and a piece of bread. The woman, surprised by his request, explained that she had only a small amount of flour and oil, just enough to make one last meal for herself and her young son. After that, they would have nothing left. The drought had affected her as well, and she had reached the end of her resources. But Elijah reassured her, saying, "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow, though she had little to offer, decided to trust Elijah's words. She went home, made the bread, and shared it with Elijah. And just as he had promised, her jar of flour and jug of oil did not run out. Day after day, she had enough to feed herself, her son, and Elijah. This miracle was a sign of God's provision, showing that He could provide even in the midst of a drought. It was also a testament to the power of faith. The widow's trust in Elijah's words allowed her to experience God's power firsthand. But then tragedy struck. The widow's son, her only child, fell gravely ill and died. Overcome with grief and anger, the widow confronted Elijah. She felt as if she had been cursed, as if God had abandoned her. "What do you have against me, man of God?" she cried. "Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her words were filled with pain, a mother's anguish over the loss of her child. Elijah, moved by her sorrow, took the boy in his arms and carried him to the upper room. He laid the boy on his bed and began to pray. "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him," he cried, stretching himself over the child 3 times. His prayer was intense, filled with a deep longing for God's intervention. Then, something miraculous happened. The boy's life returned and he took a breath. Elijah carried him downstairs and handed him to his mother. The widow, seeing her son alive, was overwhelmed with joy. She declared, "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This miracle not only restored her faith, but also showed the depth of God's compassion. After 3 long years, God spoke to Elijah once again, telling him to go back and face Ahab. The drought had reached its breaking point, and now it was time for the people to see who the true God was. Elijah knew this would be a confrontation like no other, one that would decide the future of Israel. Elijah went to Ahab and told him to gather all of Israel, along with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. He had a challenge in mind that would reveal the truth for everyone to see. When the people arrived, Elijah stood before them and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." The people were silent, unsure of what to say. They had been caught between two beliefs for so long that they didn't know where they stood. Elijah then proposed a test. The prophets of Baal would prepare an altar with a bull on it, and Elijah would do the same. They would each call on their God to send fire to consume the sacrifice, and the God who answered would be the true God. The people, eager to see the outcome, agreed to the test. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their altar and began calling out to Baal. All morning they shouted, danced, and prayed, hoping for a response. But there was only silence. As the hours passed, they grew more desperate. They began to cut themselves, letting their blood flow as a sign of devotion. But still, there was no answer. Elijah watched them with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He knew their efforts were in vain, but he also knew they had been led astray by false beliefs. Finally, it was Elijah's turn. He called the people to come closer and began rebuilding the altar of the Lord, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. To make the miracle even more impossible, he poured water over the altar 3 times, soaking the wood in the sacrifice. Then he prayed a simple prayer. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." At that moment, fire from heaven fell, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench around the altar. The people were stunned, falling to the ground in awe and fear. They cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" This powerful display of God's might turned the hearts of the people back to Him. Elijah seized the moment, ordering that the prophets of Baal be captured and put to death. With the prophets of Baal defeated and the people of Israel momentarily turning back to God, Elijah knew it was time for God to end the drought. Climbing to the top of Mount Carmel, Elijah knelt on the ground, his face between his knees, and began to pray. His heart was full of hope that God's mercy would soon restore the land. He had done everything he could to bring the people's faith back, and now it was time for God to renew the land itself. Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for any sign of rain, but each time, the servant returned with the same response. There was nothing. 7 times Elijah prayed, sending his servant to check each time. This persistence reflected Elijah's deep faith, his certainty that God would answer him. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes faith requires waiting, trusting that God's timing is perfect, even when the answer doesn't come right away. On the 7th time, the servant finally reported a small cloud rising from the sea, as tiny as a man's hand. Elijah knew that this small cloud was a sign of the promise he had been waiting for. He told his servant to go to King Ahab and tell him to prepare his chariot because a heavy rain was on its way. Soon, the sky darkened with clouds, the winds picked up, and a heavy rain poured down upon the land, ending the long and punishing drought. The rain was more than just water for the thirsty ground. It was a symbol of God's mercy, a tangible sign that He had not abandoned His people despite their sins. The parched earth drank in the rain, and soon the rivers and streams began to flow again. Crops could grow once more, and life returned to the land. The people were filled with relief and awe, understanding that this rain was a gift from God. But while the people celebrated, Jezebel was furious. She had heard of the defeat of her prophets, her plans for Baal crushed by this prophet of Israel. Enraged, she sent a message to Elijah, swearing that by the next day, he would be dead. Her hatred for Elijah ran deep, and she would stop at nothing to destroy him. Elijah, who had just experienced one of the greatest victories in his life, was suddenly filled with fear. This fierce queen had the power to kill him, and Elijah was exhausted from the battle he had been fighting for years. In a moment of despair, he fled for his life, journeying into the wilderness, far from Ahab and Jezebel's reach. As he walked, the weight of his mission pressed heavily on him. He had given everything to this cause, stood against kings, and endured hardship, yet it felt as if nothing had truly changed. Finally, overwhelmed and exhausted, Elijah collapsed under a broom tree. In his desperation he prayed, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors." This prayer revealed a deep sense of despair and vulnerability. Despite his faith, Elijah was still human, and the relentless opposition he faced had left him feeling alone and defeated. He fell asleep, his spirit weary and broken. While Elijah slept under the broom tree, an angel of the Lord came to him, gently waking him with a touch. The angel provided him with bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water, urging him to eat and regain his strength. Elijah, though still weak and despondent, took the food and water, feeling a small measure of comfort from this simple act of kindness. After he ate, he lay back down and fell asleep once more, still weighed down by his sadness. But the angel returned, waking him again and saying, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." This time, Elijah understood that he had more to do. With the strength from that food, he began a journey of 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. This journey was significant, not only for its physical challenge, but for the spiritual renewal it represented. Elijah was journeying back to the place where Moses had once encountered God, where the commandments were given, and where the covenant was made. It was a place rich with meaning and history, and Elijah was being called back to it for a reason. When Elijah finally arrived at Mount Horeb, he took refuge in a cave, finding shelter and solitude. As he sat there, God spoke to him, asking, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" In response, Elijah poured out his heart, expressing his feelings of isolation and failure. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Elijah's words revealed the depth of his struggle. He felt alone, as if all his efforts had been in vain. He had stood firm in his faith, yet the people still rejected God, and his life was in constant danger. It seemed as though everything he had done had made little difference. Then God told Elijah to go out and stand on the mountain, for he was about to pass by. As Elijah waited, a powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks in its path. But God was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground. But again, God was not in the earthquake. After that came a fire, blazing and fierce, but God was not in the fire. Finally, after all the noise and destruction, there came a gentle whisper, a still small voice. In this quiet moment, Elijah sensed God's presence. It was not in the mighty wind, the rumbling earthquake, or the blazing fire, but in the soft whisper that spoke to his heart. This encounter reminded Elijah that God's power is not always in grand displays, but often in the quiet, personal moments. It was a profound experience that helped Elijah see that God was with him, even in his despair. Once again, God asked Elijah, "What are you doing here?" Elijah repeated his feelings of isolation and dedication. But instead of giving him a direct answer, God provided him with a new purpose. He told Elijah to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. These instructions were a sign that Elijah's work was not yet done, and that God's plans would continue beyond his life. God also revealed to Elijah that he was not alone. There were still 7,000 faithful people in Israel who had not bowed to Baal or kissed his image. This revelation gave Elijah comfort, reminding him that he was part of a larger plan, a plan that he could not see in its entirety, but one that God was guiding. With renewed purpose, Elijah set out to find Elisha, the man who would take up his mantle and continue the prophetic mission. He found Elisha in the fields, plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. Elisha was a farmer, a man of the land, but God had chosen him for something much greater. Without saying a word, Elijah walked up to Elisha and threw his cloak around him. This gesture was a powerful symbol, a way of saying, "You are chosen. You will carry on my work." Elisha immediately understood the significance of this act. He knew that by accepting Elijah's cloak, he was committing to a life of service, a life that would be challenging and filled with sacrifice. Elisha, moved by the call, asked Elijah if he could say goodbye to his parents before leaving. Elijah allowed him, understanding that this was a significant step for Elisha, who would be leaving behind everything he knew. Elisha returned to his family, slaughtered his oxen, and used the wood from the plow to cook the meat. He then shared the meal with his family and friends, a final farewell before beginning his new life. This act was more than just a goodbye. It was a symbolic breaking from his past. By burning the plow and slaughtering the oxen, Elisha was showing that he was fully committed to his new path. There would be no turning back, no returning to his former life. He was ready to follow Elijah and serve God, no matter where that journey would lead. From that moment on, Elisha became Elijah's companion, learning from him and growing in faith. They traveled together, forming a bond that went beyond mentorship. Elisha's loyalty and dedication to Elijah would later be tested in powerful ways, as he would soon face the reality of carrying on the prophet's mission alone. Though Elijah had won victories and brought rain back to the land, Israel's rulers remained corrupt. Ahab, ever hungry for power and wealth, coveted a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. The vineyard was located near Ahab's palace, and the king wanted to turn it into a vegetable garden. He offered Naboth money or a better vineyard in exchange, but Naboth refused, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Ahab returned to his palace, sulking and angry. Jezebel, seeing her husband's distress, took matters into her own hands. She devised a sinister plan to take the vineyard by force, showing once again her complete disregard for justice and morality. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, instructing the leaders of Naboth's city to hold a public fast and to place Naboth in a prominent seat. During the gathering, they were to bring in false witnesses who would accuse Naboth of blasphemy against God and the king. The penalty for this accusation was death. Jezebel's plan was executed perfectly. The city's leaders, fearing Jezebel's wrath, followed her orders without question. Naboth was falsely accused, dragged out of the city, and stoned to death. With Naboth gone, Jezebel went to Ahab and told him that the vineyard was now his to claim. Without hesitation, Ahab went to take possession of it, showing no remorse for the injustice he had allowed. God, however, saw everything that had happened, and he was not silent. He sent Elijah to confront Ahab in the very vineyard he had taken from Naboth. This encounter was filled with tension, as Ahab had no doubt heard of Elijah's victories over Baal's prophets and the power of his God. As Elijah approached, Ahab addressed him with disdain, saying, "So you have found me, my enemy." Elijah, unafraid, replied, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." He then delivered a harsh prophecy, declaring that Ahab's entire household would be destroyed. He warned that dogs would lick up Ahab's blood, just as they had licked up Naboth's, and that Jezebel would meet a violent end. These prophecies were a reflection of divine justice, a reminder that no one, not even a king, was above God's law. Ahab was shaken by Elijah's words. Though he was a man given to idolatry and cruelty, the prophecy struck a chord within him. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted, showing a rare moment of repentance. God, seeing this act of humility, decided to postpone the punishment, saying that the disaster would not fall on Ahab's house during his lifetime, but during the reign of his son. Even in the midst of judgment, God showed mercy, demonstrating his willingness to forgive those who turned to him in humility. As the years passed, Elijah sensed that his time on earth was coming to an end. He knew that God was preparing to take him, but he didn't know how or when it would happen. With this knowledge, he began a journey, traveling from one sacred place to another, accompanied by Elisha. It was a farewell journey, a way of saying goodbye to the places that had been so significant in his life. Their journey began in Gilgal, a place with deep spiritual meaning. From there, they traveled to Bethel, another sacred site. Along the way, groups of prophets approached Elisha, saying, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Each time, Elisha responded, "Yes, I know, but do not speak of it." Elisha was aware of what was coming, but he did not want to dwell on it. His heart was heavy, and the thought of losing Elijah was almost too much to bear. From Bethel, they traveled to Jericho, and finally, they arrived at the Jordan River. Each step of this journey was filled with a sense of finality, as if Elijah was walking through the chapters of his life one last time. At At the Jordan, Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. The river parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. This miraculous act was a reminder of God's power and a final demonstration of Elijah's faith. On the other side of the river, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha, with a heart full of devotion, replied, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." This was a bold request, not for wealth or fame, but for the power to carry on Elijah's mission. Elisha wanted the strength to lead Israel and to be a true servant of God. Elijah acknowledged the difficulty of the request, saying, "You have asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise it will not." This promise was both a challenge and a blessing, a final test of Elisha's faith and dedication. As Elijah and Elisha continued walking together on the other side of the Jordan, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Elisha's heart pounded, aware that his master was about to be taken from him. Each step felt heavier, as though he were carrying the weight of their shared mission and friendship. Elijah had been more than just a mentor. He was like a father, guiding Elisha through the intricacies of faith, strength, and endurance. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A fiery chariot, blazing with an intense, almost blinding light, appeared from the heavens, drawn by horses of fire. The chariot roared with a power beyond anything Elisha had ever seen. The ground seemed to tremble, and the air crackled with divine energy. The chariot swept down toward them, separating the two men with a force that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind, lifted from the earth in a vision of pure glory and power. Elisha watched, his eyes fixed on his master, his heart pounding as he cried out, "My father! My father!" the chariots and horsemen of Israel. His voice was filled with both admiration and grief, a final farewell to the man who had guided him and shown him the path of faith. As he watched Elijah disappear into the sky, carried by the chariot of fire, Elisha felt a profound sense of loss. Elijah was gone, taken into heaven by God, in a way that no other prophet had experienced. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been a constant testimony to God's power. Elijah had stood against kings, brought rain, and shown the people of Israel the true power of God. Now, he was being honored in his departure, a final testament to his faithfulness. As the whirlwind faded, something fell from the sky. It was Elijah's cloak, his mantle, the symbol of his authority and power. Elisha picked it up, holding it with both hands, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had now been passed to him. This cloak was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a reminder of Elijah's mission and a sign that Elisha was now the chosen prophet. With the mantle in his hands, Elisha knew that he would no longer walk in Elijah's shadow. The mantle represented the power and authority of God, and by picking it up, Elisha was accepting his new role as the leading prophet of Israel. His heart was filled with a mixture of sorrow and purpose. Though he had lost his master, he had gained a calling, one that would shape the rest of his life. As he stood by the Jordan River, holding Elijah's mantle, Elisha felt a surge of faith. He took the cloak, rolled it up just as Elijah had, and struck the water, saying, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" To his amazement, the river parted, just as it had for Elijah, and Elisha crossed over on dry ground. This first miracle was a sign that Elijah's spirit truly rested on him, and that God's power would now work through him. The other prophets who'd been watching from a distance saw this and recognized that Elisha was now their leader. They approached him with respect and reverence, acknowledging that the spirit of Elijah had indeed fallen upon him. Elisha's authority as the new prophet of Israel was confirmed, and the people knew that God's work would continue through him. Elisha's ministry would be filled with miracles, much like Elijah's, but with a unique focus on compassion and provision for the people. He purified the water in Jericho, making it drinkable and safe, showing God's care for the basic needs of the people. He multiplied oil for a widow in debt, providing enough to sustain her and her children, demonstrating God's compassion for the poor and the downtrodden. Elisha's miracles were a testament to God's love and mercy, showing that he was not only a God of power, but also a God who cared deeply for the needs of his people. Through Elisha, God provided food during a famine, healed the sick, and even raised the dead. These acts were signs of God's ongoing presence with his people, a reminder that he had not abandoned them even in their struggles. Each miracle reinforced Elisha's role as God's chosen prophet and served as a reminder to the people of Israel that they were not alone. Though Elijah was gone, God's power remained, and his commitment to his people was unwavering. Jezebel, the queen who had brought idolatry and corruption to Israel, met a grisly end as prophesied by Elijah. When Jehu came to confront her, she tried to charm him, dressing up and calling down from her window. But Jehu was unmoved. He ordered her servants to throw her down from the window, and her body was left to be devoured by dogs, fulfilling the prophecy that Elijah had spoken so long ago. The end of Jezebel was a powerful symbol of the consequences of defiance against God. Her life had been one of manipulation, violence, and idolatry, and in the end she faced the full weight of divine justice. Her death marked the end of an era, a turning point for Israel as the nation began to turn away from the idols she had promoted. With Ahab's house destroyed and Jezebel gone, Israel had a chance to return to the ways of God. Jehu's zeal for God's word led him to cleanse the land of idols and restore the worship of the true God. This period of purification was a pivotal moment in Israel's history, a time when the people were given the opportunity to renew their commitment to God. Though Jehu was far from perfect, his actions were a fulfillment of God's will, and they served as a reminder that God's purposes would always prevail. Elijah's prophecies, though harsh, had come to pass, and the people of Israel saw that God's justice was not something to be taken lightly. This return to obedience was a chance for the nation to start anew, to learn from the mistakes of the past and walk in the ways of righteousness. Elijah's life was marked by a fierce faith, one that remained strong even in the face of overwhelming adversity. From standing against King Ahab to challenging the prophets of Baal, Elijah demonstrated a faith that did not waver, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. His courage serves as a timeless example of what it means to trust in God completely, no matter the circumstances. Elijah's journey reminds us that faith is not just about believing in God's power, but about acting on that belief, even when it's difficult. His life was a testament to the power of one man's commitment to God and the impact that such a commitment can have on an entire nation. For those who feel alone in their faith, Elijah's story offers hope, showing that God can use anyone willing to stand for truth. One of the most powerful aspects of Elijah's life was his prayer life. Whether he was calling down fire from heaven or praying for rain after years of drought, Elijah's prayers were a direct line to God. His persistence in prayer, even when the answer didn't come immediately, teaches us the importance of relying on God's timing and trusting in his wisdom. Elijah's prayers were not just requests, they were acts of faith, demonstrations of his dependence on God for everything he needed. His life shows us that prayer is not about forcing God's hand, but about aligning our hearts with his will, trusting that he knows what is best. Through prayer, Elijah found strength, guidance, and the power to perform miracles, showing that true effectiveness comes from a deep connection with God. Elijah's relationship with Elisha illustrates the importance of mentorship and the passing on of wisdom and faith. By choosing Elisha as his successor, Elijah ensured that God's work would continue even after he was gone. This act of mentorship was a powerful reminder that God's mission is bigger than any one person, and that each generation must be prepared to carry the mantle forward. Elijah's mentorship of Elisha also highlights the significance of investing in others, of sharing our knowledge, experience, and faith with those who will come after us. It is a call to each of us to leave a legacy of faith, to prepare those around us to continue the work of God, and to ensure that his message is passed down from generation to generation. Throughout Elijah's life, one theme stands out above all others: God's faithfulness. Whether in times of triumph or despair, God was with Elijah, guiding him, protecting him, and providing for him. Even when Elijah felt alone, God was there, whispering to him in the silence and reminding him of his presence. Elijah's story is a powerful reminder that God is faithful even when life is difficult. His faithfulness is not dependent on our circumstances, but on his unchanging nature. For those who feel lost or abandoned, Elijah's journey offers reassurance that God is always with us, that he will never leave us nor forsake us. The life of Elijah is more than just a story. It is a blueprint for a life of faith, courage, and obedience. His journey challenges us to stand firm in our beliefs, to trust in God's timing, and to leave a legacy that honors him. Elijah's unwavering commitment to God and his willingness to confront injustice remind us of the power of one individual to bring about change, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Through Elijah's life, we see the importance of remaining faithful, not just in the good times, but also in the moments of doubt and fear. His legacy calls us to live with purpose, to rely on God in every situation, and to remember that our lives can have a lasting impact on those around us. Elijah's story continues to inspire, reminding us that we are never truly alone, and that with God by our side, we can overcome any challenge. May Elijah's life encourage us all to live with boldness, to seek God's presence in every moment, and to trust that his plans are always for our good. His story, though rooted in the past, speaks to our present, calling us to a deeper and more committed relationship with the one who is faithful, yesterday, today, and forever. Please like this video, comment down below, and subscribe to this channel.